Stefano, you confirm you can see it, right? Great. So, as you see from the title, I'm going to focus on what I call the social dimension of the emission trading system, a topic that is close to my heart, but it's close to the heart of many in this panel, I would say. We all know that the EU ETS is the pillar of the European climate policy, and now is old because we just celebrated 18 years. I don't know when was the day for the celebration, but in any case, it's an old system, and so it could vote now. There's 18. I don't think it's a good idea, but in theory, and it keeps growing. It has been extended over time, and it's going to be extended to new sectors, maritime, buildings and transport, and new gases like methane and nitrous oxide for shipping from 2026 onwards. And during this growth process, we also observe a more mature system with carbon pricing rising over time, especially from 2017, when a series of reforms, in particular the Market Stability Reserve, helped increasing credibility of the system. And this was reflected by the increasing prices with a system that proved to be resilient to the COVID crisis in 2020, but also to the Ukrainian war and the energy crisis later on. So now the price is, let's say, between 80 and 100. It was 81, I think, 2 days ago. It's been above 100, but this is the range in which it seems to be stabilized now. And if we look at the other emission trading system, they follow a similar path. The followers of the ETS, as I entitled long ago my book, follow a similar path as the EU ETS, as you can see from this diagram, which shows the Swiss ETS, which converged to the European one due to the linking, the UK ETS, which diverged, left the EU after Brexit, the New Zealand ETS, California and Quebec with just one line because they are linked, and at the very bottom, China, which basically just started. So it's in its infancy. So most of them have followed a rise in prices, although you have some falling trends in New Zealand and more recently, if I don't get wrong, in the UK, which in my view are both linked to distrust in the government commitment to the policy, because both the UK government and the New Zealand government came up with, signals that were slowing down the process. The UK in the very last weeks, New Zealand when it basically adopted a less ambitious climate policy, much less ambitious than what was suggested by the Climate Change Commission of New Zealand. So this is probably the reason. In any case, these trends have been accompanied, as we all know, by an increase in energy prices. And here I want to compare these trends looking at carbon versus energy prices in the period 2016-2023. In blue, you have the European ETS, in red, natural gas, and in green, the oil Brent price. And as you see, the ETS price, which is much lower, achieved and overtook the others, increasing up to a level of 140 above the Brent and certainly above gas, that although it had its own pikes during the war, is basically back to the original level. And the same can be seen if we zoom into the more recent period, more, let's say, closer to the Ukrainian war. You see, taking January 2019 as the initial value of 100, basically the EU ETS grew by 4 times to 400. The oil Brent by 50% to 150, and gas is back to its original level. But the energy spikes and the increase in energy price in general, 50% is not little anyway, created much concern. So on top of the growth in carbon prices. And this is actually what, in my view, represents the next challenges of the ETS. The distributional concerns, so the distributional effects that it may have, and which raises a keyword that had been discussed already in the previous panel, social acceptability, and the competitiveness concerns, which, again, another keyword we discussed, raise the point of possible carbon leakage. These two topics are the object of the live project we are currently running at the European University Institute, which is called COAS, which stands for Collaborative Observatory for Assessment of the UTS. The final goal is basically have an observatory on the data concerning the EU ETS and sharing this information with the regulators of the main ETSs, which are part of the project, like the European Commission for Europe and the regulators China, New Zealand, California, Quebec, and Switzerland. And obviously, the acronym is a tribute to Ronald Coase, who gave such an important contribution in the field. Given the time constraint, I want to be fast. I will focus only on distributional effects today, but obviously happy to discuss the rest in the rest of the panel if needed. And I start from a very simple consideration. We all know that carbon pricing has regressive effects because poor households spend larger income share on carbon-intensive goods, face higher financial constraints to adopt low-carbon technologies, and are more likely to suffer job losses in carbon-intensive sectors. So this raises the issue of the social acceptability of higher prices and raises a number of questions, also research questions, that I think we should address. Is there a maximum price level that people are willing to accept? How can we increase the acceptability? Well, we probably know the answer from the literature. For instance, Carattini and others have shown that the acceptability of the policy depends very much on how carbon pricing revenues are used. And this was said also in previous panels. But then the question is, do we have enough money to do the policy we want? So it's important to understand what is the amount of carbon pricing revenues, how are they used, and how they change with carbon pricing. Now, I will briefly touch upon these questions. What is the amount? Well, this diagram that is taken from the World Bank's recent report on state and trends of carbon pricing shows that the amount of global revenues from carbon taxes and ETS, so carbon pricing broadly speaking, has been growing steadily, also exponentially, I would say, over time, from 2006 to 2022. And as you see, the blue bar, the blue part of the bar, which is ETS revenues, has basically reached and overtaken the red part, which is carbon taxes. So we basically have 7 and 3, 69 and 31%, 69 from ETSs and 31 from carbon taxes. And the lion's share of these 69% is certainly represented by the EU ETS. West and Pisani-Ferry has shown that, estimated that ETS revenues could range between 800 and 1,500 billion euros by 2050. So it's a huge amount if you compare it to, for instance, the coronavirus aid package that was 750 billion euros. Certainly, the coronavirus aid was concentrated in little time, and this is spread over a much longer period, but we are talking about big money, I would say. Cumulative, yes. On top of that, we have the Social Climate Fund that is planned to start before the ETS2, so on building in Strasbourg, will kick in, and is expected to raise 86.7 billion euros. 65 from the auctions, plus 25% on top of that added by member states. So over a much smaller period, 26, 32. Finally, this money are probably bound to increase because auction revenues will increase with higher prices. So this is a good message. We probably have the money to compensate vulnerable people. But I want to add a reflection that is a bit more cautious, especially on the last bullet point. Revenues are likely to increase with higher prices, but maybe not hand in hand. And to show that this might be the case, I want to show you this diagram from a paper I'm doing with a colleague, Matteo Mazzarano, which suggests the possible decoupling of pricing and revenues, or carbon pricing and carbon revenues. Carbon pricing being in green and carbon revenues in, what is it, brown, whatever. And as you see, at some point, basically starting from 21, there is a decoupling with prices that keep growing, but revenues that start falling. How that can be the case? Well, if prices get very high, obviously firms will, and this is the final goal of the DTS, will try to abate more, but then they don't need to buy allowances, so the demand of allowances decreases and the quantity being sold decreases, so that you have two countervailing forces. Price goes up, the quantity go down. Now, to dig deeper into this, we'll look at the relationship between revenues and prices, and in different forms. Total revenues, per capita revenues, which can be considered as a measure of the possible redistribution to people of the of carbon pricing, revenues per unit of GDP, so compared to the scale of the economy, and also in log terms to get the elasticity of revenues to prices. And as you see, this is a non-parametric approach. You basically see what flattening of the curve, okay, in all the different measures we took into account. And then we start thinking, okay, there is a flattening, but will there be a declining curve? And we try and see if there are signs, let's say, of a possible carbon, what we call a carbon Laffer curve. And indeed, we find the turning point, which in our estimations, which are based on data from 2012 to 2021, daily observations of auction revenues and prices, would occur, I say would, but at around 92.5. We're not far. That's the point that I wanted to stress. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there are signs that it might happen at some point, and that point might not be too far. So just to get to the conclusions, because as a moderator, I don't want to go on myself. The message is as simple as that. Higher carbon prices raise distribution and social acceptability concerns, we all know. But on the other hand, they also generate higher revenues that can compensate more vulnerable households and sectors. However, these revenues might stop growing at some point at high carbon price levels, or even start falling, so describing a carbon Laffer curve. For this reason, I'm not saying, okay, what a pity. No, I'm saying we should probably do more, in the sense that auction revenues should not be the only source for compensation if they are not enough. If they are enough, fine, but if not, we should think of other, already now, think of other redistribution policies, because in my personal view, these are key for the social acceptability of DTS. And if I can be a bit provocative, I think these are key also for the survival of climate policies in general. If we don't have social acceptability, I don't think any proposal or any continuation of our effort in the long run will go through. So I think it's something we really need to focus carefully on. And on this, I stop and leave the ground to the next speaker. Thank you.